So it will be really quick. It's another book review. Maybe a few months ago, I watched the video Evolutionary Architecture from ThirdWorks CTO. And at that time, I realized that I don't know enough about architecture, or my understanding is very outdated and old-fashioned. So I decided to research on the ground to research this topic. I'm reading some books, articles, and so on. So I picked this book, Clean Architecture. It's called Clean Architecture. The bit above is from me. This book is from Robert C. Martin, also known as Uncle Bob. He also wrote another book. This one is very popular, Clean Code. I think Sergey did a lightning talk based on this book or something very similar when he mentioned about some clean code techniques. So I decided to pick his recent book on architecture, not Sergey's, Robert's recent book, Clean Architecture. It was written in 2016, so 3 years ago. Yeah, I liked it. I wanted to show you some highlights that I've got from this book. The main point that the author highlights is that you need to think about architecture all the time. You can't postpone it. You can't make random messy decisions now and then architect it properly later, because otherwise our software will become like fast food, one-time use, and we will not be able to build long-term solutions. Instead, we will be always rebuilding, restarting from scratch, re-architecting, and then throwing it away again and again. So architect exercise is ongoing process. Again, connected to previous point, often we all are in rush to deliver some features, but it's always in software development, it's always better is faster. If you mess things up, it will slow down you like immediately. It will be harder to deploy, it will be harder to onboard new developers, and so on. Another interesting point which I wanted to share with you guys, and maybe you have your own opinion on that, is that we developers are stakeholders when it comes to meetings with the clients, when it comes to decision making. Developers are stakeholders as well as the client, as well as the CEO of company, and so on. The reason why developers are stakeholders is that every application has two sides. One side is shiny, feature-rich side that every client wants to grow, and another side is structure, organization of that application, basis of this application that allows us to add more features to make application reliable, stable, performant, and so on. While stakeholders, like common stakeholders, clients, managers, are usually on the first side. They want to have more features, more power for their application. There's now no one on the other side, on the structure side. And if we as developers don't protect this side and don't raise our hand when we understand that that structure needs to be adjusted or tested or reorganized in terms of, I don't know, microservices or monoliths or something like that, then very soon both sides will be in trouble. Stakeholders won't be able to add new features and so on. So we as developers, our job to be stakeholders of our architectures. It doesn't mean that we need to spend all time and all budgets cleaning things up and building perfect, unuseful things, but it means that we need to take care of the structure, because we are people who understand how it should be organized. Another interesting point from the book is that architect is a programmer. Sometimes you can see that there are positions in companies, architect, and I was curious what those people do. In fact, we all are architects, and every architect who spends their time building systems from scratch or doing high-level plans for and roadmaps for applications, they all are programmers. The author of the book says that ideally architects are the best programmers. They have the most experience, they know the most of patterns, they saw many things in their life, and that's why they can sometimes suggest some good patterns and good solutions. Yeah, the primary purpose of architecture, and this is very high level quote, to be honest. I don't like it because outside of context, it's really about nothing, but the whole book is about this. It explains that the primary purpose of architecture is to support the life cycle of a system, not features itself, but everything that allows you to build features, to replace one feature with another, to reorganize deployment, like migrate from one hosting provider to another. Good architecture makes the system easy to understand, so onboarding new developers, easy to develop, one command install, for example, easy to maintain, fix bugs, apply security updates, easy to deploy. The ultimate goal is to minimize the lifetime cost of a system and to maximize programmer productivity. So basically, we all saw cases when adding a new feature, even relatively small feature to existing code base, would be so high effort, so hard, that we would recommend as developers, let's not do that. It's really time consuming, hard, and we don't know if the system will work properly. Instead, let's rebuild from scratch, or let's search for another solution. So the good architecture, the primary goal of the good architecture, to postpone this situation as much as possible, so we will be able to add new features without such headaches. A goal of a software architecture then should be to make a system that can be easily deployed with a single action. It's another quote unrelated to the previous one. Sorry for this random collection of quotes, but I like this one because and it is connected to my previous talk about biz DevOps. Again, I thought that DevOps is very narrow and not very important part of the project, but I changed my mind after reading Accelerate book. And in this book, the author also says that actually testability and deployability of the system is part of architectural decisions. When you organize your file structure in folders, when you organize your services, then you think about your functions and how they communicate with APIs and so on. You also need to figure out, to always think how you will be testing this and how you will be deploying it. And if you don't care about it when you develop, you may end up with architecture that is very hard to deploy, very hard to test. Let's say you can only test it on production. And there are systems that are built this way, that you don't have an idea how it will work until you deploy it to production. There is a lot of criticism around frameworks in this book. And this was a trigger for me, because I realized that most of my experience is around frameworks and tooling. I spent a good portion of my life learning Drupal and Drupal Way, and I thought that it was time well spent, because Drupal is not the worst CMS in the world, and they made some good decisions, and I learned how to organize code in a modular way, and then with Drupal 8 with some things on top of it, services, dependency injection, and so on. The author criticizes all of that because he thinks that if your organization or yourself as a developer focus too much on frameworks, then you are in a risky situation, because you're kind of marrying that framework. And it means that you commit to this framework, you spend a lot of time learning it, let's say the learning curve from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, or from jQuery to React, instead of spending time and building some features. And this is very safe and cheap for a library maintainer, because they don't care about you, but you care about them, because if they break something, backwards compatibility, for example, or if they decide to change their roadmap, you are kind of in a situation then you need to fight with framework to get what you need done. And sometimes it turns out that you need to wrap your architecture, your product around framework, and that framework dictates the architecture. So the author's opinion is that architecture should tell readers about the system and not about the frameworks that are used. And we know that there are many projects that you open and you see technologies that are used, frameworks that are used, but you can't really figure out what they are doing without doing deep investigation. There was another point that I forgot to add, probably. Basically, the point of the author is that frameworks are not architecture, they are implementation detail. Ideally, you want to be able to switch from one to another, and you should very carefully pick up those frameworks. And this makes me think that I should probably spend more time and learn more about architecture and different solutions around it, to avoid being like only Drupal girl who can architect things only within one system. That's something that I thought that I was reading this book, and again, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Another bit that was criticized is microservices pattern. Again, the book was written 3 years ago. I think it was.
Why? There's no reason. Microservices are so perfect.
Yeah, so I was very sad that I read it a week ago and not 2 years ago, 3 years ago. The idea is very nice. You want to decompose, you want to structure your application, but the author says that you need to do it step by step, something that Ev and I recently did in one of our projects. First, you just extract it in a separate class, on a separate function or separate folder, but you still keep everything as a monolith. You leave opportunity to extract it in a separate service. But the author explains very well how costly might be early decision, without good reason, early decision to separate certain things in microservices, because communication between those services is very expensive. When it's one code base, it's cheap. One function calls another function, and if you did something wrong and divided your application in a bit wrong way, it's relatively cheap to refactor, move things around. If you do it from day one, then you're locked by this decision, and it is really hard to do this evolutionary architecture when you already made all decisions. And in general, advice from the author when architecture things, leave as many decisions open as possible. Make only those decisions that must be made right now. If you can decide later which exactly framework to use, then decide later. If you can decide later to extract this into a separate service, then decide later. Structure your code that it will be possible to plug in a new service or extract a service in a separate process, but don't do things before you really need it. Sounds like very obvious thing, but I think we all should remember about it when we do anything, basically. Yeah, the book is Clean Architecture. It's not all contents of the book. Actually, there are a lot of things about patterns, solid patterns, applied. These patterns were initially described in Clean Code book, but the author applies kind of the same set of rules to architecture, how you organize your components, how you organize your dependencies, interfaces, don't repeat yourself, and so on. It's really hard to talk about these things without real examples, so I will not do that. But you are very welcome to read the book. And the nice thing, this book is actually criticized quite a lot in the community, I believe, because the first book so good that the second book, it was hard for the author to beat the success of the first book. But what I liked is that author provided some use cases. So he takes some example, like video learning portal, and explains how he would design it using his own advice. So if you need more details how to apply these rules, you can find them in the book. And yeah, for me, how is it called? Food for later thought is to figure out how I feel about frameworks versus non-frameworks and all that stuff.
Yeah, this is interesting. Thought generally, frameworks versus not frameworks. It depends on who you try to please. From developer's point of view, of course, I would love to be, as a developer, I would love to be focused just on writing code. And it kind of makes sense because this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm passionate about. I'm sitting in an isolated world and writing something that makes everybody excited and feel proud of my work. But remember why frameworks exist: to deliver the work faster. It doesn't make sense to reinvent the wheel. At first,
Right.
then another thing, and then you can here's a framework, which is still, any framework is an opinionated way of doing something, and depending on how big the community they're behind a certain framework, you can tell how much opinionated this system is. Because recently, even Drupal was Dries opinionated framework, but then now I don't think there are much things of which Dries adds to the product. It's more like thousands of contributors all over the world. They drive the product, not one person, and it helps to make the product less opinionated and more based on best practices. So if all developers in the world would be building one framework, it would be the less opinionated framework ever possible, obviously. So it depends on the size of the community, right? So my point is, obviously, the aim from the client perspective, they're interested in getting the work done faster, and frameworks are very good for that. I'm not sure why the author didn't mention this, because this is the most obvious thing. Yes, you're kind of locking in yourself within framework if you're learning framework and you're basing some work within the framework. But it's a trade-off. Probably if you were writing a new Facebook, you would not pick any framework, probably, or actually pick something with a large community and rather generic, with the opportunity to move from it in the future. But it wouldn't be like a very niche framework which solves a problem, and that it would be basing a work on top of that. That wouldn't make sense. And here I agree that you shouldn't be like switching frameworks as crazy and trying to, instead of trying to think what works for a client, you're thinking what do you know, what sort of tools you know, and then you're jumping into these tools and trying to solve the client's problems with the tools you know. That's a wrong approach. And here, probably that's one of the thought behind this book, behind this phrase of this book. But like I said, we should consider the client needs, not only what makes us as a developers more happy and
Interesting thing is that I think the thought was that developers are excited about frameworks and switching to, the most shiny thing and so on. And that's generally fine if your system isn't tied very much to a certain framework. Otherwise, let's say you're using WordPress and you decided that you need to, add e-commerce on top of it. And I'm not expert of WordPress, but let's say that they have some solution for that. You start using it, but then you realize that not you personally, client realizes that they need to extend it. And the framework that was chosen isn't the best fit for that use case. And now you're kind of locked. You can't easily extend because you're messed with all this WordPress stuff, and this WordPress defined your architecture. So it's not like this is super pet shop and plus some WordPress. It's WordPress and small pet shop inside of it. But I'm not sure how to build the systems on top of frameworks, but at the same time to be completely independent of them. Let's say the new WordPress version is released. You will need to do follow upgrade path, maybe update some modules and so on. And this will not benefit the client. Why they need it?
The thing is, WordPress probably is not the right example here because it is not a framework. It's a system, it's content management system.
It doesn't matter, if not just framework, any tools.
Well, basically, okay, let's think about this from different perspectives. Think about React.js. And if you were to write a new project, or React Native, if you were to write a new project based on with heavy user interaction, it kind of makes sense to write this in JavaScript, right? Not on PHP or something, because user interaction is done in browser, which means that you have to use JavaScript to a certain degree. You wouldn't like, or the client wouldn't like to have developers starting the work on a pure JavaScript, because there are many tools, like frameworks actually, which help you to get started faster. It's literally focus on writing the CSS and the interaction with a huge community and libraries for this interaction, rather than start building everything from scratch. And this book is kind of saying, well, frameworks kind of suck, build it well.
Because in a year you will say, well, it's all outdated, we need to move to another framework and redesign all stuff. And as far as I know, many big companies do front-end rewrites quite often.
Yeah, that's a problem of development generally. Tools get old. Nobody's writing on, well, no, I'm saying nobody is writing on Pascal, but I mean, there are very niche areas where programmers still write in Pascal for normally for all computers, for maybe like factory machines or something that can support only low-ish level programming languages, and they don't have enough computing power and so on and so forth. But if you're doing the development in the modern world, you sort of have to keep up with all this stuff. And tools are, there are always new tools, there are always new frameworks, and the development moves ahead very, very fast. You can't just write a bespoke software and say, we're not going to keep up with all this stuff happening in the world because we don't need to upgrade. There's nothing to upgrade. We are cool. We don't need to use anything new because there's no new version of our software because we develop our software.
There's interesting story in that book. The author, it was the old story from his early experience. He was working on a project, something similar to collecting assets, and they stored it in file system, but not in normal file system, in something low level. It was very old project, random access files, and everything worked very well. They didn't need relational database because the nature of their application didn't require anything like that. But then their salespeople asked them to add relational database to the system because it's cool. It was very trendy at that time. They just appear and everyone thought it's the best and the only way to store data. The author said that they don't need it, why they would migrate their data to database. It's not the perfect fit for their architecture. But some other people decided to do that. That guy left the company, so they migrated things to relational database. And guess what happened next? No ideas? Do you think it was successful migration or not?
Of course, no.
Of course, no. I felt the same, but because the author explained the situation, but he said, actually, I was wrong. The guys were very successful, not because of relational database, but because that was easier to sell. It was trendy, and even if they didn't really use relational database and those features, it was good decision for the business. So sometimes even this kind of situation can happen, that you need to plug in something to your architecture and it should not break your application. Okay, relational database, we don't need it, but let's have it. Okay, I think something is going wrong on my computer, but we can still wrap up, I believe. Pavel, Alexei, do you have any questions?
No. No, I don't have.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kate. I think developers quite often forget about the fact that they're not just building features for a client. They build a code as well as that. They build an architecture, they build a structure, they make a lot of decisions which will impact the project they work on. So it's not, I know some teams that by the look of their work, they just kind of, here's a feature, done. Here's a feature, done. Doesn't matter what's going to happen. Like, develop like there's no tomorrow is their slogan. And they work for years for the same client. They get into, they deliver the work. Client is kind of happy, but they still deliver the work. So it kind of works fine, even though there is no proper transparency, no sometimes things go wrong. Sometimes there are problems with QA, but they still can deliver fast because only their objective is to deliver the business value, ignoring all human aspects of the project they work on. But it still works. And then after a few years, a client will be unhappy. They will let the team go. Eventually, then there will be a new team which will come to the same project. They will be terrified, and there are a few ways from that point. Either they will convince the client, this client, to rewrite things from scratch, or they will say that, well, we'll have to support this shit for a while. It's shit, but you understand that you can't do anything like that, and they will keep.
And you should write a book about it.
Yeah, there are many things.
That was clean architecture. Yours will be dirty architecture.
Dirty architecture. Nasty architecture.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thank you very much, Keith.
Thanks.
Thanks.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.